How you guys doing? And welcome to another episode of People Management Digest. My name is Lucas Pesa. We're actually very happy to have Stephen Fitzgerald of Habanero Consulting back with us. We had a conversation with him on an earlier podcast about the people management strategy and having a policy of non-policy and allowing accountability and flexibility in with a workforce and sort of all the intricacies and nuances that pertain to that. So we're obviously happy to have him back. He's going to be joining us again on April 25th for a panel discussion at our conference. So we're looking forward to having him there. So Stephen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely, no problem at all. And obviously, and this is something we touched on at the sort of tail end of the last time we chatted, which is initially we were talking about the sort of context around the conversation, the broader conversation of having a culture of flexibility, a culture of accountability, what that even means, and how managers can sort of gauge their approach when it comes to that type of a management strategy. Today, we're going to obviously take a little bit of a deeper look into more specifically what you will be speaking about at on the panel on April 25th, which is the actual strategy or policy of non-policy, specifically, what it is and what it means and how employers can sort of utilize it. So I thought a good opening question for you, just to sort of kick us off, would be just to sort of define what a policy of non-policy even is. Because obviously when it comes to management and knowing how to allow accountability and flexibility, there are a lot of sort of ways people will define that. Some people think of accountability and flexibility as one thing, and other managers will see it as another thing. It might be depending on industry or communication style. So in your estimation, how would you define a sort of a policy of non-policy?
How would I define the concept? To me, it's about letting humans be humans, and it's interesting. For me, that I'm reflecting that policies are artifacts that grow in organizations as a response or an outcome to something going wrong.
Yeah.
So at some point in the history of this organization, whatever hit the fan, and we created little policies to make sure that never happened again. So that's actually really important context to look at the rules and policies that are there, and open your mind to the possibility that if we actually set people up with a clearer set of clear capabilities, clear intent rather, and the right capabilities, a human will beat a rigid rule in terms of doing the right thing every single time if they're set up right. So this idea of non-policy, in my mind, is really about what can we do, what can we structure an organization to help people make better decisions. So what goes into that? And to me, the structure that has to be around for that to be successful is you need to set the bones up right in your organization. Everyone in your organization needs to know why you exist. What's the purpose of the organization? What do we really value, and where are we going? What's our vision? And then they need the tools and the trust and the kind of open culture, I guess, and trust to be able to go from there. So it's about being really clear about those kind of basic structural fundamental ideas, and then understanding where gaps might exist for people, and not necessarily stepping in with a policy or a how-to or a set of rules every time, but actually supporting the gap in a very humanistic ways that allows people to use their creativity and their judgment to do what's right.
It's interesting. One of the things that I sort of, and this was more so at the beginning of what you were just discussing, policies were sort of made as almost in response to something negative happening and a company having to sort of plan for the future in case, something happened where they experienced the same thing and they had to be aware of dangers and that kind of thing. So in a sense, policies obviously exist for management purposes and to keep structure and to fend off risk, but it's almost as if the policies are sometimes made as the origin is almost is that they were made as a safety net, not necessarily as a springboard for innovation kind of thing.
Yeah, it's actually, I'm fascinated by this, but in the Industrial Revolution, when you had people coming in from farmers' fields and sole craftspeople who were, maybe they were making clocks at one point.
Yep.
They're coming into a factory and they're working on one assembly part of a Model T. Like, imagine that scenario. The jobs that people had to do were highly mechanical.
Yep.
And they were bringing people in with no background in doing that. So most of these structures, a lot of which still exist today, hierarchy and rules and procedures and these things, they come out of that era. But if you think about it, the U.S. Labor Bureau has been tracking this since the early 70s. They've been tracking the number of jobs in the U.S. economy that are creative or heuristic, and the number of jobs that are mechanical. And the
Yep.
chart is amazing. There's almost no mechanical jobs left in
Yep.
the economy anymore. But
Yep.
yet we still have policies and procedures that go back to the time when we were trying to get someone coming in. Used to have a creative entrepreneurial bent working as a farmer. Now we want him to, assemble this part of the steering system exactly the same every time. We don't actually want them to think and be creative. Well, that's just not how work is done these days. Everyone's job, by and large, is highly creative. So but we still have these systems that are set up for this old economy.
Yeah, almost a sort of outdated approach of sorts. Well, I mean, one thing I wanted to sort of ask you to build on that, because in my estimation, what managers are sometimes aware of when it comes to actually implementing a policy of flexibility and accountability and creativity is if you allow almost too much flexibility and too much, I guess, flexibility is probably the best word that I can think of. But if you allow too much of that, it's almost as if you run the risk of people almost taking advantage of it. And so I guess my question for you is, do you feel that there are some real challenges that come with allowing a culture of accountability and flexibility? Do you think that there are some real, not necessarily challenges, but are there some risks that come with allowing a culture of non-policy and that level of freedom?
I guess if I'm forced, I have to admit that there is risk, but I actually prefer to characterize it as it's just going to be messy.
Yeah.
And I think if you are open to allowing people to learn through failure and make mistakes and learn from that, if you accept that baking a cake requires breaking some eggs, and that's part of the journey, and you can build an environment of trust, as long as it's clear for people and they're getting the right coaching, then I think this is a no-lose strategy. So will you have to overcome some risk along the way? Certainly. And in some industries, that the risk is the product of probability and consequences. In some industries where people's health's concerned, or massively large amounts of money and things like that, the risks can be really high. So it's not setting up people for success if you just throw them in there without the right support. But it also doesn't mean that you need to rigidly control everything they do.
Fair enough.
Those aren't opposing ideas, and I think that's the important thing here.
And how would you say that, obviously when it comes to implementing a style of management like this, and even I think you mentioned this, that it takes obviously a little bit of time, and there's a sort of messy process, not necessarily a messy process, but there's a transition period, that sort of exists when you move from a culture that is, to your point, maybe a little bit, obviously you were talking a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. So, when we have a culture that doesn't necessarily enable the maximum amount of innovation or creativity, how would you say that when trying to get buy-in from executives that this is a beneficial management style? Because obviously that's going to be, the executives are the ones who they carry the most responsibility, and they have the most they have the most experience to obviously make these calls that are, to respond to things happening in the marketplace. So how would you say to get buy-in from executives that a sort of a more accountability-driven and a more flexibility-driven culture can actually be beneficial?
This is an awesome question, because there is a mountain of data, that your organization provides and a lot of other organizations provide that talk about all the different quantifiable ways that organizations perform higher, when people are engaged this way. And so there's from a data point of view, there's very little arguing against this. However, I do know that I run into organizations and leaders who can intellectually buy that, but they're still not there.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important, because your question was very specific around how do you get buy-in from executives, or how do you help them along the journey. And I feel like you need to recognize, just in the same way that when you give employees more autonomy and it's a messy journey, it's the same thing for executives. You need to have some empathy for their journey as well.
Yeah.
And we even go to the extent of empathy mapping and journey mapping for these senior executive teams to get a clear sense of really what they're up against personally to get to make progress along this journey. What's stopping them from their next step along this journey? And so one of the things is with the idea that actions inform behaviors, inform beliefs. The first start of the journey is there's simple ways just to get going on doing this, simple changes and how things get done. As long as you're continually pushing for those, to support that action leads to behavior, leads to belief mechanism in the organization with those leaders, and they're starting to see the results, you'll see them move. And the other comment I have about this is sort of at a personal level. If you're in an organization and you feel like this is happening, but you're not seeing the change, I think this is sort of difficult to say, but I think you need to question your viability at that organization. If you really believe in a humanistic organization is best run where you can get them, people build great careers and the organization reaps the benefits from that in that order, and that your leadership sees humans and machines as more or less interchangeable, if you're not making progress or they're not moving along that journey, I'm not sure that they will. So some leaders, I think, are stuck. And those organizations, I think, would be very hard, if not impossible, to change until there's new leaders in the organization. So, if I was in that situation, working for a leader, I'd try to be very honest with myself of whether or not there was really a possibility for change to happen. If there was, I would support it with all my energy. But if there wasn't, I would cut bait. I would move on.
Fair enough. And so, obviously we've been talking a little bit about, and you even just touched on it a little bit, when it comes to empathy mapping and when organizations are, relatively stuck and trying to figure out where they fit on this, in this sort of landscape of having a culture of, I guess if you want to call it flexibility, or if you want to call it having, the more accountability, or whatever you want to call it. For the organizations that do seem to not necessarily have enough, for those organizations who aren't necessarily far along enough in the progress of transitioning into a culture like this, where there is more sort of teams leading teams and accountability and that kind of thing, for organizations that are trying to get there, what are some first steps that you think would be helpful when implementing a successful policy of non-policy?
Yeah, I would. One of the things I'd be tempted to do is a bit of a culture audit to really understand where people are at, because getting here, one of the first things you need to do is figure out how to meet people where they're at in the process. So there's value in understanding, having a deeper sense of the culture. And I'm not talking about, we're a work hard, play hard culture, those kind of vacuous maxims or ideals about what you think your culture might be about. I'm talking about doing some proper empathetic research from someone who has some objectivity on it. So it's hard to understand the system when you're part of the system, and this is a situation where it's very valuable to get some outside support to really find out what's going on in your culture. And that will allow you to figure out where the opportunities are. And you'll probably see opportunities in areas like, I mentioned purpose and values and vision before. It is really common for people, and it shows up in a really obvious way when purpose isn't resonant enough for people in the organization. That leaves a hole for them. And that I'm not saying it's an easy thing to address, but it's often a really important thing to address early on in the journey for organizations. You'll find other things come up like a lack of trust, and understanding what is it that's breaking down the trust is really critical. And there's another thing that's important is understanding how cross-functional teams work, and how decisions are made, and how much control teams themselves have to make decisions. Teams have to be great, and we talked earlier in the last conversation about self-forming teams. But whatever you can do to create stronger teams is almost always a powerful asset in this journey for people. And then you have to think about these things impacting the entire organization. It's siloing it and trying to create this environment and part of your organization is by definition already the wrong way to go. Creating this kind of cultural change should be cross-cutting across the organization, because silos end up being very destructive, especially when one part of the organization starts to be more successful and the other doesn't. That creates a bigger problem.
Yep.
So it's really important to think, step back and kind of take a systems view, think of the whole organization. How do we raise the water level for everyone? And where are the opportunities, or could it be trust, or understanding and how we bring our purpose to life, or are we living our values, or do we have a trust in our organization? All those kind of things are really the places to get curious about as to whether or not you're set up for success in this journey.
Absolutely. Well, Stephen, a lot of great points that we've covered, and that was the sort of last question that I had that I wanted to ask you to round off the conversation. So, obviously, this is the second time we've had you on, and we're looking forward to hosting you on April 25th, when obviously you're going to be in Toronto. So we're looking forward to that. For those folks who want to follow Habanero, make sure you follow them on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Or you can check out their website at habaneroconsulting.com. And if you want to follow Great Place to Work Canada, be sure to do that on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And obviously, you can check out our website at greatplacetowork.ca. For those who are interested in coming to our conference, which is taking place this April, on April 25th, Stephen is going to be a panelist in a really interesting conversation that I'm looking forward to, where the panel will be having a conversation very similar to the ideas that we've been discussing pertaining to building a culture of accountability, having a policy of non-policy, what the sort of intricacies are, how to successfully put one together, what the sort of what success looks like when trying to put together that kind of a culture. So we're looking forward to having a lot of interesting perspectives on that panel, and we're looking forward to obviously hosting Stephen as one of the panelists. And for those who are going to be joining us at our conference, it's been approved by the HRPA for 6 hours of accreditation towards your HR designation. So be sure to join us and obviously gain your credits. Stephen, we appreciate you joining us on the podcast now for the second time, and we're looking forward to seeing you on April 25th.
Yeah, thanks for having me.